Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hippie Chick Historian podcast. Today we have Graham Phillips with us, who is a famous author and historian. He's going to be talking about the legend or the proof that he's found about King Arthur. So take it away then, Graham.
Talking. Okay, cool. Well, it all began really about 50 years ago when I was a journalist working for the BBC. And one of the things that I mean, I was pretty young then, but one of the things that I investigated was the story of King Arthur. And of course, at that time, I thought the whole thing was ridiculous. But I came up with a few clues then that there might be something behind it. So I started to investigate the whole idea. And ultimately, as I went along, I began to believe and then found proof that there really was some historical figure behind the legend of King Arthur.
Right, so that started you off. So what was the next step? What sort of evidence did you find, and how did you go about discovering more?
Well, it began really with I mean, set the story of King Arthur. He became really famous because a load of authors in the Middle Ages started writing about him and writing romantic tales of the king in shining armor who fought dragons, rescued damsels in distress. Well, clearly that was made up, but they all claimed that it was based on a character that really existed. Not in the Middle Ages, but way earlier, about 1500 years ago, shortly after the Romans had left Britain, a period known as the Dark Ages, when law and order pretty much collapsed. And I thought, okay, what are they talking about? Earlier references to Arthur. Well, one particular one, for example, written in the early 800s by a monk named Nennius, he refers to a figure called Arthur who existed around 500 AD. And he discusses him in a completely no nonsense sort of way. He's not talking about dragons and damsels in distress and all this sort of thing. He simply refers to him as a warrior who united the Britons in their defense against an invasion by the Anglo-Saxons. Now, to give some background to that, the Romans had left Britain in the 400s because Rome was being sacked by these Germanic tribes and the Roman Empire was pretty much over. And Britain was an outpost which virtually was suddenly left without law and order, with no Roman soldiers around anymore. And country broke up into lots of different feuding kingdoms, which allowed various invasions of Britain. We know this because very few records survive from that time for a whole host of reasons. One, because the country descended into anarchy. Another, because of Britain's terrible weather conditions. The manuscripts rotted away unless they were kept very dry. So we don't have much from that time, except for this monk Nennius. And he talks about the various British kingdoms fighting each other and allowing invasion on three fronts. One, and the most important one, is from Germany with the Anglo-Saxons. Now, most people tend to think of the Anglo-Saxons as the native English, if you like. Well, they might be the English, but they're not the native Britons. The native Britons were already here, being ruled by the Romans. The Anglo-Saxons invaded from the late 400s, and finally, by the 600s, they'd taken over most of what's now England, which was named after them, Angleland, pushing the native Britons into now what we call Wales. In fact, the Welsh were once the inhabitants of all of Britain, and they were the native Britons. So, okay, so the Arthur, Welsh if you like, or Brythonic is the true name for the people back then. The Anglo-Saxons are invading. They're also the Picts from Scotland are pushing over Hadrian's Wall. Irish bandits, as they call them, are raiding the Welsh coast and all over the place. There's problems. And Nennius says that a man called Arthur managed to unite all these bickering British tribes into one fighting force that managed to repel these invasions, push the Anglo-Saxons right back into what's now the southeast of England. And he discusses Arthur and says about 12 battles that he fought, and he was victorious in them all as he pushed back the invaders. And so this is an historical figure that seems to have been behind what later authors thought, well, a mighty guy, he was really important. Let's write stories about him. So that's kind of how it starts.
Yeah, fascinating. So there is actual physical proof that a King Arthur did live then, and it's not just all myth and legend.
Well, the interesting thing is there are other early stories that survived about Arthur, mainly in Wales, because remember, as I say, he was leader of the Britons, the Welsh. So it's obviously in Wales that all of these legends were written down and his story survived primarily. And in England, obviously, the Anglo-Saxons, they regard him as the enemy, so he's not going to be recorded by them. Now, okay, how did this warrior of the Dark Ages become this character? I mean, you're talking about him living around 500 AD. Some 700 or 800 years later, these authors in the Middle Ages suddenly started writing about this guy, depicting him as with his knights in shining armor and living in huge Gothic castles. Well, that was a medieval setting of the Middle Ages. They didn't have those kind of huge Gothic castles at his time. They didn't have that kind of plate armor either. They would have looked more like late Roman soldiers, and their defences wouldn't have been the kind of Gothic castles we associate with Arthur, but more fortifications like wooden stockades and earthen embankments like the Romans used to use. So, how did this change? How did the Arthur get supplanted from a historical period into the Middle Ages, 700 years after his time? Well, it's all down to the way that the medieval mind thought. They didn't know what people looked like at the time of the Roman Empire and when the Romans collapsed. In fact, if you look at paintings from the Middle Ages of the crucifixion scene, you see the Roman soldiers at the foot of the cross dressed in plate armor and helmets like knights of the Middle Ages because they had no idea what they looked like. There hadn't been proper research done then. They didn't know archaeology and so on. So that is why they thought, well, we don't know what Arthur would have looked like, but he must have looked like our jousting knights and he had a golden crown. And that is how he got supplanted into the Middle Ages. So we've got a real Arthur. We've got a character that's invented in the Middle Ages and becomes the theme for all sorts of fictitious tales. And because those fictitious tales are all about chivalry and knights and armor and dragons and you name it, that is why today people will go around saying, Arthur is just made up. It didn't exist at all. They're right. That Arthur didn't exist, but there was a far more interesting character that really was the last person to defeat the Anglo-Saxons for a long, long time, that is worthy of recognition. And that is what I started to do and to try and seek who this Arthur was and where he came from.
Okay. Yeah, it's all right. No, my fellow's just asking me if I remembered to hit record. I did. So he knows me too well. Yeah. So on March, I'll remember this date because it's my 50th birthday. On March the 22nd, you've got a tour of Winchester. Is that right?
That's
So
correct, yes.
what's the significance of Winchester then?
Okay, well, Winchester is the one place in all of the country where there is more Arthurian tradition than anywhere else. To start with, you've got the most people know about the round table, which is hung on the wall of the Winchester Castle, which is now known as Winchester Great Hall. There's a great big, enormous 18-foot wide table hanging on the wall, painted in different coloured segments. Now, they were painted at the time of Henry VIII. In fact, Henry VIII had himself depicted on it. But the actual structure itself is very much older. And in fact, there is possibility that some of the original wood of that table could date back to the time of an historical Arthur. There's got to be more research done before we can find that out. They did do some some carbon dating on a part of it that they said, oh, well, that was created in the 1200s. But that was only part. If you look at the back of it, they've got photographs around the Great Hall of the back of it. You can see that there's different pieces of wood. When part of it rots away or gets damaged, they replace it. And so it had been replaced over the years. It's like the ship of Theseus in mythology. You know, if all the planks are replaced, is it the same ship? If every piece of wood in that ship has been replaced. Well, this seems to have been what happened to the round table. So it could go way back. And there are certainly references to the round table going back over 1,000 years. So, you know, it may have had something to do with an historical Arthur. Now, why Winchester? Well, the research that I've done has suggested that Camelot itself may have been elsewhere, but Camelot was the name given to Arthur's capital that he basically created, he built himself. Earlier, when he started his reign, the capital in all the various romances that were written in the Middle Ages is set in Winchester. In fact, the most famous of the Arthurian stories, written by Thomas Malory, which is called Le Morte d'Arthur, that was the film, that was the book that was made into the film Excalibur by John Boorman, probably the most famous Arthurian film. He basically sets most of Arthur's time at Winchester in Hampshire. Now, what's supposed to have happened there? Well, the very earliest tales refer to Arthur drawing the sword from the stone to prove himself king outside Winchester Cathedral. Okay, the cathedral that's there now is from the Middle Ages, but there is reference to an early Roman church on that site, and it could have actually happened there. Why this whole idea of drawing a sword from a stone? Well, it may have had something to do with a confusion of the word saxum, which is an old Latin word for a chunk of stone, and the word Saxon, the people who are invading, or the shortened name for them. Maybe there was a story written in Latin of Arthur drawing the sword, taking the sword, i.e. the fight, from the Saxons, i.e. defeating them, and it then got turned into somebody later who didn't understand Latin too well, taking the sword from the Saxons, a stone, what? That may be how it came about. But whatever it was, whatever Arthur was first, how he became king, he is said to have first become king at Winchester, which was Uther Pendragon, his father's capital. There's an old Roman well there that's been recreated into a kind of modern recreation of a Roman temple that's associated with the first Grail legends. You've got a chapel there that was said to have been when Arthur and Guinevere married. There's many things in Winchester that are associated with Arthur. So I thought it would be the best place if I was going to give a tour and talk about all my different research that I've done into Arthur and his connections with any place in the country, if I went to Winchester and did it there, where all these places are in walking distance of one another. So, okay, what do you want to know about the sword and stone? Well, it was said to have taken place here outside Winchester Cathedral, then discuss that, discuss Excalibur, what it might be. And so that's basically why I'm doing a one-day tour of Winchester on the 22nd of March, a Sunday.
Yeah, I would have come along, but like I said, it's my 50th birthday weekend, so I've got
Oh,
far
no,
to
you stay in bed or whatever you do on a 50th birthday. That was a long time ago for me. I can't remember it. It's so long ago.
So, what's next? And you've written quite a few books, haven't you? And you've got your own YouTube channel. You're doing tours. What else do you do to promote yourself and get all your.
Okay, well, I mean, King Arthur is one of the things that I've done research into. I mean, it's probably what I'm very well known for, particularly since I was able to determine what may have been the historical Camelot, which is where Arthur eventually sets up his headquarters, if you like, at an old Roman city in the centre of England called Viriconium, because when the archaeologists did the dig there, they found it was refortified at exactly the time Arthur was said to have lived. There is also documentation in the British Library that actually says who ruled there around 500 AD. this most powerful city in the country at that time after Winchester, because Winchester was eventually overtaken by the Saxons, so they had to move. That's how they ended up in wound about Shrewsbury area in the centre of England. And then what happens is we find in this genealogy in the British Library, which is a family tree of people who ruled that area, one of the characters who ruled there, we know, for example, by a another monk who wrote within living memory of the time called Gildas. He refers to the person who ruled there by his battle name. Now, a lot of the British warriors at that time were given an honorific name of an animal. The fox, for example, if they were cunning, or the lion if they were rampaging. He was known as the bear, and this monk who's writing in Latin refers to him as Ursus. If you take that back to Brythonic, the language spoken in Britain 1500 years ago, the word for a bear is Arth. Very similar. In fact, Arthur is the bear because now in modern Welsh, YR, Ir, I think you say it. Arth is the bear. Then you'd often have the coming after it in the Latinized version of Brythonic. So you've got a man called Arthur who actually ruled from that place. So anyway, there's a lot more than that, but that's really why I became pretty famous for the Arthur story. But you ask what other things I do? Okay. I've written 25 books, I think, all
Wow.
in all. I've been I've been researching. What have I done? Okay, I researched. I did a book about the Holy Grail. Went in search of that, and obviously there's Arthurian connections. So I
Yes.
did that in its own right. I went in search of the Ark of the Covenant. All these things like Indiana Jones was doing, and all this was back before the Indiana Jones films. And in fact, what happened was when one of the Indiana Jones films came out, the one that was where he went looking for a crystal skull, they had a DVD box with all the various, the three that there were then, Indiana Jones films. And they wanted to do another little disc that went with it that was a documentary about people who had searched for a grail, people who had searched for the Ark, people who had searched for magic stones. And they had me there, and George Lucas himself described me, thank you very much, as a real life Indiana Jones.
Oh,
So
wow.
that's
Very
kind of
flattering.
what I
Yeah.
am.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So you're quite famous then for your research, and you've been on a lot of TV shows as well, haven't you? There's a recent one that you're doing. Is it Strange Britain, Weird Britain, something like that?
Yeah, well, over the years, I mean, if you go on my website, incidentally, which is grahamphillips.net, there's links to all my various things. There are all the various books I've got. You click on them, you can find out there. I'll make sure that people know all about the books. You actually don't really need to have to buy the books to find out all about what it's about, especially books I did some years ago. And so you can follow all that through. And on the front page as well, there's a link to my IDBM. IDB? Anyway, the
Yeah.
film
I
thing
know.
with all people's
Yeah.
TV appearances in them. And I've been doing things going back, wow, I don't know, 30 years on TV shows, various documentaries, dozens of them. But more recently, I've done a lot of stuff with ancient aliens, not because I believe in ancient aliens, but then because I've researched so many interesting historical mysteries, they'll bring me on to say, for example, okay, Excalibur, King Arthur, tell us the legend where it was supposed to be an invincible sword and light flashed out of it. And that's what the history is. Then they'll have somebody else saying, it's aliens, it's a ray gun. So I don't go on. But I'm somebody they have on to explain the history behind some of these things. The Ark of the Covenant, what was it? Well, according to the Bible, it was a radio for talking to God, and it was a sort of some form of weapon that light came out of and blasted the enemy armies. So, right, yeah, that's an alien thing as well. So that's kind of how I get involved in that. I'm on the Unexplained a lot. That's the show with William Shatner. A lot of my shows are the American TV ones on account of the fact that my publisher is American and most of my books now are more
Okay.
well known over there. But this show that you mentioned, Weird Britain, totally British thing. I was in last season's, and for this new season, which comes out in May. I'm in practically every single episode, and a couple of specials they're doing as well about various subjects. So I'm kind of like the man to go to for that. And that's a very interesting show because it goes into all sorts of mysteries in Britain. Everything from Loch Ness Monster to mermaids seen swimming in pools in Cornwall to people searching for buried treasure, King Arthur, Robin Hood, you name it. And so that's in May. It's on the Blaze channel, but then it ends up on the Sky History channel ultimately.
Yeah, so yeah, you've certainly done the rounds then with all the big TV shows and everything. So that must have been really exciting. All the hard work you've done is, being pushed out there, and it seems like you're well
Well, I've
respected.
been lucky enough to be able to do what I actually enjoy doing. I mean, it all starts going back to when I was in my mid-20s, as I mentioned, with the Arthur thing, when I was a journalist working for BBC Radio. Then ended up getting a job as an editor of a magazine that looked into the paranormal and the unexplained, and that got me hooked. So yeah, I've written books. I've been published by some of the bigger publishers in the world, like in this country, Penguin, Collins, and so on over the years. But it's never made me rich. I haven't done it for that because,
No,
okay, you get a book and you can't really write another one for a couple of years or a year. You finish a book, you've got to wait a year before it comes out. And then you don't really get that much royalties off it. You've spent so much money doing research. I mean, if you're a novelist, great. You make it all up in your head
yeah.
and it's all profit. But not when you've got to race around Egypt and Israel and the Middle East and charge across the whole of America from the north down to Argentina and so forth to do research. It costs a lot of money. So what I would do is I'd have to go and get a job for a few months to get some money together and then go back to doing some research again. And then I'd get paid and I'd be all right and up and down. But I love doing it.
Yeah, it sounds very, very exciting. I'd love to do something like that. But maybe when I retire, I don't know. But anyway, thank you, Graham. It's been wonderful talking to you. It's a fascinating subject. I love the King Arthurian legend because, well, I'm Welsh myself, so it's
Oh, well,
always,
there you go. You're
yeah.
descended from it.
Yeah,
Okay,
probably.
well, thank you very much for having me on.
That's okay. Right, take care then, Graham. Bye.
Okay.